My name is Steve Krauss. I have the honor of being the incoming vice chair for the Acquisition Management SIG this next year. And one thing I wanted to point out is that each of you have at your desk or at your table there this handy infographic that was designed in conjunction with the white paper that Ben was talking about earlier. Since I don't think many of you necessarily had the chance to read the white paper itself, this infographic summarizes a number of the key points. As Ben mentioned, at OFPP's behest, ACT-IAC put out this survey. We had almost 1,000 people respond to the survey, which was great. Even more importantly, we had hundreds of comments that people issued in conjunction with that in many ways were even more valuable than the quantitative information from the survey. But one thing that was very interesting, Leslie mentioned between Mythbusters 1 and Mythbusters 2, there were 18 different myths that were incorporated into those two memos. And when we asked people from both government and industry, what were the top 3 myths that you think still need attention addressing, you can see from the data here, 47% of the respondents indicated that we can't meet one-on-one potential offer, as an example, was one of the top 3 responses from 47% of the responses. 38% of the respondents responded with the other one. So one thing that we found that was interesting was that, among other things, the perspective from government and industry was not necessarily very different in terms of converging on specific topics that need to be addressed. So, with that, we'll be delving into that and many other interesting topics here during the course of our panel. I see we've got everybody up here and seated. Let me quickly introduce the members of our panel. Sitting to the left of me here, we have Jose Arrieta, who is the Procurement Ombudsman, is that correct? For Department of Homeland Security. To the left of him, Al Munoz, Project Manager within the Customer and Program Management Office of the Office of the Chief Information Officer for USDA. Next to him is Joanie Newhart, the Associate Administrator for Acquisition Workforce Programs, I believe, right, within OFPP at the Office of Management and Budget. And on the far end of the panel, Kimberly Hancher, who's the Chief Information Officer for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC. So why don't we kick this off with you, Joanie? Just tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, I think you have a bit more of a hands-on perspective of what exactly has occurred with Mythbusters 1 and 2. And I think everybody here in the room is familiar with the initiative, but from your perspective, what kind of key achievements have we seen thus far, and what do you see as we look down the road towards the potential Mythbusters?
Sure, thanks, Steve. Yeah, this has been a really great effort of all the things that we do at OFPP. This one has gotten a lot of attention, and I'll tell you, industry seems to love Mythbusters. We hear that all the time. The government folks kind of warming up to it. So it's been a couple years now, a little over 2 years since we issued the first Mythbusters memorandum, and we asked ACT-IAC to help us determine if there have been some changes out there. We've been hearing, anecdotally that yes, things are getting better. We wanted to put a little data behind it, but I do think that agencies are trying to reach out to industry more. One good example is you'll hear from Jose about what DHS is doing. They have a special industry liaison office. I mean, that's tremendous. We didn't have that a few years ago. And we're hearing individual success stories for procurements out there that are involving industry more and getting better acquisition outcomes. So I think a lot of good things are happening. I am hearing that some contracting officers are just not sure where to start. And so we have a couple tools out there. Leslie mentioned the videos. There's some really good hands-on tips in the videos. Hopefully you'll hear some today also. But talk to your fellow contracting officers. There's a lot going on and little things that you can do to just get started. And I think the tide is turning, and we're going to keep the full press on that with Mythbusters 3. So as we get into more of a discussion, I really want to pick your brains about what you think would be most helpful for that, because we're ready to engage in that.
So that sort of tees it up for Jose and Al here. I'd like the two of you to talk a little bit about what's the role that you're playing within your respective agencies, and how long have you been playing that role, and what are your primary objectives and priorities? Jose.
Well, I'm the procurement ombudsman at DHS. At DHS, we have 23 agencies that are mashed together. We spend $17.2 billion a year across 9 different contracting activities. We have a strategic plan for all those contracting activities, and we have 4 priorities. One of those is quality industry government communications. So we've created this vision that we want our folks to communicate better with industry. We understand that the business of government is an intersection of policy, law, and then you have business. And on our end, we also have security. And as it relates to our mission changes based on a threat or a disaster, right? So communication with industry is key for us to achieve our mission. So essentially what we've done is we've created this Office of the Industry Liaison, and we've established touch points in each of our contracting offices. And we use them as a sounding board to, 1, encourage them to communicate with industry. 2, they report at a high enough level to actually work with contracting folks and give them the tools they need or a backboard to say, hey guys, what you're doing is correct. Go out there and communicate more often. And 3, they're our communication touch point out into the entire organization. So our office is kind of a change agent within DHS to drive communication across this large enterprise. And it's done because we've prioritized communication at the highest level. Dr. Nayak has prioritized it and said we will do this better because it directly relates to our mission.
Gotcha. Now, how does that compare with what's going on with the USDA?
So USDA is structured a lot like DHS. We have many, many different component parts that are out there doing missions that actually have nothing to do with one another or very loosely correlated, perhaps. Like the food stamp program, and perhaps inspecting meat. Okay, so those are 2 things that are related. They're around food, but they're not so much people working together. So we have a lot of missions going on out there. And in my work with the senior procurement executive and now the chief communication officer, I'm kind of behind the scenes, kind of the communicator with the communicators, right? So I'm kind of in the middle, kind of liaising between the program offices and the contracting offices, and kind of taking this whole knowledge about Mythbusters and communicating with vendors and improving acquisition outcomes, and sharing that between those 2 communities so that they don't have kind of that fear of getting out there and talking to the vendors. What's interesting is it's spread beyond kind of what we think of as the contracting model. We're going out and we're looking for things to vend. Just recently, our SNAP program, because of the number of vendors that they have that they're working with, has started to pick up the program itself also, and it started to pick up some of the principles of communicating with the vendors that they have, providing services out directly to the public. So it's kind of an interesting thing to watch happen as we interact more with each other and we start to increase the amount of communication. And this year, interestingly enough, because there's been so much less spending than there's been in prior years, we've been able to focus on things like communication and strategic sourcing, where in the past we were so busy buying things that we didn't really have an opportunity to do that. So this is getting much, much more attention from inside the Department of Agriculture this year.
I'd just add that, so we both described a structure so that you can influence an organization, but then you have to create kind of pockets to drive and interface with industry so that people become comfortable with that engagement. So Mythbusters creates a nice foundation for you, right? And in Al's case, and in my case, you have senior level support that's saying, hey, this is okay, we're actually going to measure this, we want you to do it. But then you have to look at your workforce and you say, well, what do they get trained in? Well, anybody here that's an 1102 has been to a comm class. Probably half of the 1102s and all the PMs have been in project management classes. But have you ever been to a class on how industry does business? Do you know what the bid and proposal process is and the costs and time associated with that? Steve Charles will come in and talk to our workforce soon about the structure of an OEM and how they operate. So what we're doing to actually make that structure work is we're bringing together small groups of people, and we're highlighting private sector business practices, because we feel that the better our contracting officers understand how the private sector does business, the more comfortable they're going to be engaging. So it's twofold.
Great. So that's a great point. Let me leave this for a moment and head over to Kimberly, kind of looking at this from a different perspective, really sort of almost from a customer's perspective inside the agency. I'm curious, Kimberly, What have you seen that has changed, and what have you seen that it still needs to change since the Mythbusters campaign started a couple of years ago?
Well, I've been a CIO at the EEOC for 5 years, and I was really pleased to see both of the Mythbusters memos come out because they really sort of highlighted what I felt were some of the really core behavior problems that we have in overall federal IT procurement. The agency that I work at is really small. Our spending, the IT spend is under $15 million. So my interest is in making sure that we've got contract vehicles that will serve us and that we can afford. And so a couple things that I've done and our agency is sort of matured with in terms of vendor interactions has been focused on small business. So we do an industry day for small business every year. We also have really leveraged the activity that every agency does, and that's an advanced procurement plan. We all have to have that posted on our website by a certain date. And we've really put a lot of work into making it as accurate as possible in terms of providing what our requirements are going to be and what our procurement plans really are for that year. And I think that that's also one area that could be leveraged a little bit more because we all have to do that. And sort of making that advanced procurement plan come alive, so to speak, so that it guides the discussion between government and industry. And the other thing that we've done is put together sort of a fast facts about the IT program that can be used in any vendor meeting that just kind of tells a little bit about us, about our organization, how many people we have, government employees, how many contractor on site, what services do we outsource, what services do we cross-service with other federal agencies, what our technical infrastructure looks like, just at a summary level, and it really helps get some insight into us as a customer.
So, Jose and Al, kind of curious. Your roles, I think, are relatively new, and you're doing these on a full-time basis. And Joanie, I think there's a number of other agencies as well that have full-time vendor communications or industry liaisons. What are you finding though as you look within your agency? How is your role being received, and what does it take to actually effectively engage with people across your departments?
So what we're finding is that there's a lot of support behind increased communication. I think there's a lot of understanding within the agency that they need to meet with industry and they need to talk about things that are out there right now, especially in the IT arena because things change so rapidly. We recently had a procurement where everyone came together from all of our different component parts and started looking at, okay, we're gonna buy this next great thing. 6 months later, they finally got around to actually putting pen to paper and issuing a solicitation. By that time, the industry had changed, and what they had decided they were going to do 6 months ago was no longer relevant. So it was a huge waste of time, but what came out of that was an even better understanding of, do we need to start engaging industry earlier on in this process? And there's a lot more buy-in, I'm going to say, both from the contracting side and from the technical side on getting that communication started early and continuing it.
And how do you do that? Kimberly mentioned, for instance, industry days being a good way to do this. And I do know from the feedback we got through the survey, there were a number of people responding, we're having more industry days than we've had before. But what are we finding, or what are you finding is either the most effective or the most common or both ways of encouraging that early engagement?
Well, the industry days are a good way of doing it, but also going out and kind of doing the opposite, right? So coming to events like this, where our contracting staff can come out and meet with industry and kind of see what's the latest thing, what's the conversation like going on in industry right now, how can we be a part of it, how can we take advantage of it, how can we improve our acquisition outcomes by understanding what they understand so that we can, purchase whatever it is that's going to best meet our mission goals.
Gotcha. Jose, I know when we talked earlier, you were mentioning some of the training activities that you've been leading meeting at DHS, and I was impressed because I was not aware of the level of specific training that's going on in some cases. You know, tell us a little bit about how you actually operationalize that.
So I mentioned our seminars, and our seminars focus on core things that our people don't understand about the business community they engage with. And that's one piece of kind of training our folks. But we do it in a seminar format so that they can engage with in Q&A. In terms of direct training, you know, one of the things that we've been doing is take debriefings, for example. And interestingly enough, it kind of came up on this survey. We looked at debriefings. We have a number of large procurements going on right now. A lot of debriefings are going to happen. And we said, really need to put our folks through a crash course in debriefings. Now, we could send them to an NCI class, but why not look at our entire spend universe? Why not target the largest areas we spend, match that up with where we're going to do debriefings, and actually we called industry in, about 24 different industry representatives. We worked through the associations like ACT-IAC, and we said, what do we do well in debriefings? What information would you like to hear? And the overall, what we heard from them is three things. One, sometimes we're confused in a debriefing. We don't know if you evaluated us on FAR 8 and 15 or 15. We don't understand best value trade-off. And then sometimes when you award to a higher price, and we actually offer something of similar value at a lower price, we don't understand that. So then what we did is we built scenarios around their feedback. We built fake scenarios around their feedback. And we said, guys, we want you to come back and play a role as industry and put our people through mock debriefings. So we took these scenarios, imagine like a Harvard Business School case study. We pushed them out to the government folks. There's 3 government people on the team, 3 industry folks on the team. We kind of gave them some details, and we told the industry people, we want you to push our folks. We want you to make them feel as uncomfortable as possible. We want you to ask questions, but questions specific to the importance as it relates to your business. Because what we realize is our folks are very far-oriented, but they're not having a discussion about the vendor's business practices. So we wanted to drive that out of the conversation, and we hold these mock role-playing sessions so that our folks can feel that, and then we feel like they'll be more comfortable when they get into an actual debriefing down the road. So we just kicked it off. Our first pilot is on June 6th, and we have 6 more planned throughout the summer. So far, it's been well received, and we think we're pretty solid on the scenarios, but I'll let you know.
All right. And do you think, is DHS, you think, on the leading edge of this? Are there other departments that are heading down a similar path with this level of sophistication in terms of training?
You know, we haven't reached out to other departments on this. I'm sure there's some other folks thinking about it. I would just say, you know, in hearing Al and some other folks talk, I think industry government communication, the idea that it's important is out there. I think the fundamental baseline is there. And the question is, how do you operationalize it? And I think a lot of that goes to your specific agency's mission and the culture within your agency. You know, you asked the question to Al earlier, how are we received? Well, we actually came up with a full-blown plan, said this is our mission, these are the things we're going to do over the next 9 to 18 months, and we were received well. But we've continuously come back to that plan and say, okay, we've done this, this is the next 7 things we're going to do. And that's why I think we're received well.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to jump in. So I spent 13 years in industry before I got into the government, so I'm very sensitive to debriefs in particular. We used to develop proposals, and nothing was more frustrating than to spend so much time, work on the weekends, give this really good proposal, not win, but then not understand why you didn't win. So then you don't know what to do the next time to do better. So I'm so sensitive to that. We have this thing every quarter called the Frontline Forum, and one of our members is here. And we get the frontline contracting folks together from all of the agencies, and we talk about different issues. And we talked about vendor engagement one time, and one of the agency's representatives said that she actually gave the actual evaluation documents to the vendors so that they would understand fully, you know, why they lost, what the issues were. And I have 30 years in government contracting, and that just blew me away. I'm like, we gave them the actual document? And I realized, you know, it's part of the problem. There's no reason why you shouldn't be truthful and upfront. They work closely with their lawyers, and this is the way that particular agency approached things. And I got to tell you, I like that approach. Honest, transparent, and let folks know.
So doesn't a lot of it still come back to people not really understanding what they can communicate, what they can't communicate? I mean, I'm sure a lot of people in this room wouldn't have been aware that it's okay to have that level of transparency.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, right? And that's why I think the Mythbusters theme kind of resonates with folks, is that there is such a misunderstanding, not only within the government of what they can do, that the FAR is this great mystery which has all these arcane rules that we have to follow on the inside, but also for the contracting officers and the contracting staff on the inside, what goes on in industry, what goes on during the process when they're responding to an RFP, and how are they approaching the government? What is their perception of us on the government side, and what are they doing to react and respond to that could actually, in fact, be hurting our procurement?
Anybody have anything to add to that? Make sure you press your buttons on your microphone. I was just reminded, this is a high-tech system we have here. Okay. Well, let's move on to something else. Al, you recently wrote an article that's in this month's NCMA magazine, or Contract Management magazine, that's actually about best practices in communicating during the acquisition process, and I wanted to ask you a question about that. One of the things that you wrote in the article was about the need to think proactively about scaling the level of communication associated with an acquisition or procurement based on the complexity or sophistication of that acquisition process. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are things that we buy, like office supplies, where we probably don't need to do a whole lot of vendor communication, right? We obviously, from what Leslie was saying a little bit earlier, we need to have some of those discussions inside the government. But when it comes to buying staplers and pens, we can probably pretty much figure it out ourselves, right? We don't really need a customer to say, I need it to be blue, it's 6 inches long, I want it to play pottery. We probably don't need those types of discussions around those types of things. But when it comes to the more complex things, and especially when you're talking about doing those complex things in terms of strategic sourcing, we do need to have a lot more communication with industry, a lot more of what's the market like, what not only for ourselves, but for the solution itself. What is it that's out there that's available? What can we do with it? But I was also thinking a little bit earlier when we were talking about a smaller organization like the EEOC, that has such a small level of spend. If you're talking about doing sophisticated things with that small amount of money, well, there's a lot of need right there to do the type of communications that we're talking about here today, so that those dollars aren't squandered, so those dollars don't go to something inappropriate, and then your entire budget is gone. It makes it more difficult to meet your mission at that point as well.
Yeah, something to add. When I was at the Securities and Exchange Commission, we had a system there called EDGAR, which is how all the firms file their financial reports. We had the same vendor for 15 years, and they decided they wanted a new approach, not necessarily a different vendor, but they wanted more open source code. And so, of course, the industry perception was, well, the same vendor's going to get it, right? So we had a really concerted effort to communicate with the industry to say, we're looking for a new approach here. So we had RFIs, we had industry days, we had pre-proposal conferences, we had everything. The chairman came and spoke to all the industry folks, and you really have to, if you're looking for a change or trying to communicate with industry, you have to do a concerted effort, because I don't think you guys can read our minds unless things have changed a little bit.
And, I think in terms of practicing what we're preaching, the IT, in the IT community, the importance of being accessible for informal conversations. I don't think I can emphasize that enough. A lot of people just find it difficult to set aside time for those informal vendor calls, meetings, webinars. But I really believe that it's very important, and it's mutually beneficial. The government staff learn a lot about the market, and there's so many different markets. Just because you're in IT doesn't mean that you're an expert in training technologies or in cloud-based technologies. And it's really through those kinds of opportunities and really participating in webinars, getting out of your office and going to events in your city taking vendor calls and spending a few minutes to talk about if you've just made an investment and you don't have a procurement coming up for an enterprise storage system, but in a year things may have changed, that gives the vendors useful information about that agency.
So Kimberly, that's a good point. I mean, the question becomes, how do we manage that kind of one-on-one interaction? Not only from the perspective of what makes it legal and fair, but also just from the perspective of time commitments. Right? That was one of the other myths that didn't actually show up as one of the top two at the end of the day. But with this question of our procurement times are already too long as it is. How do you build more of that sort of one-on-one interaction into the process without it getting out of hand?
What we've done is we've used the industry liaisons as belly buttons for anyone from industry that wants to communicate with us. And then we have them kind of educate the industry partner on where their capabilities, where what they're offering can possibly fit within our organization, and where they can look to actually do business with us. One of the interesting things.
So that sounds a lot like, there are a lot of agencies that are doing vendor management organizations. Is that the same, or is that a different group, or do you work together?
I wouldn't call it vendor management. What I would refer to it more as is we purely serve as a liaison or a consultant to them to advise them on where they should look and how they can better understand the market. One of the feedbacks that we get all the time is it's impossible to enter the DHS marketplace. How do we? And one of the things we realize is we have 15,000 contracts, 11,000 of which are small business. If you're talking about communication and you bump it up from a strategic level, there's a challenge there long term that you have to understand, but you would never know that unless you were having these one-on-one meetings with industry. So that's kind of what comes out of these one-on-one meetings, and then you bring your council together to discuss the issues that they're hearing throughout the department, and you prioritize, and that's how you kind of make changes to improve your outreach. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And if I could, what's going to be valuable to the government at the end of the day are things that are going to be relevant and timely. So we get bombarded, right, by industry folks that want to do business with our agencies constantly. Right? We're getting emails, we're getting phone calls, we're getting cards pressed in our hands to do events like this. It's all very interesting stuff, but if it's not something that we're out, if it's something that we're out of cycle on, it's not going to be something that we're going to remember 6 or 8 months from now when it comes to actually doing the procurement. So I would say, just for the industry side, watch what the agency that you want to do business with is doing. Watch what they're putting out on BizOps. Watch the types of communications that they're doing. Coming to the same types of events are very, very helpful because probably we're thinking about that at that time, and that's a good time to have a discussion with us. Filling up our email boxes with your marketing materials and bringing your marketing staff to come see us from time to time isn't really very helpful for us. It's all very interesting stuff. We really like the well-done brochures with lots of colors. Those are fantastic. They look great on the top of the
Lots of
website.
pictures, right?
Yeah.
Cool. I want to open it up to the audience for questions here, but before we do that, one thing that I wanted to ask for some commentary on specifically was the relationship between the level of communication and protest. And that is one of the topics of one of the key myths that still needs some attention to be addressed, and this fear that increasing communication between government and industry opens this can of worms that creates the propensity for protest, which is something to be avoided at all costs, apparently, according to one of the popular myths. But is that really true? What is really the relationship between the level of communication that exists and the likelihood of protests?
What we found when we did our debriefing training is that many protests result from the fact that an industry partner was not given the information that they asked for. They weren't told, they didn't understand why they lost, so they protested to learn. And so we use that and say, hey guys, do you want to spend X number of days responding to a protest? Or do we want to get comfortable, fully understand what we can release to this industry partner and really explain to them why they lost? And I'll tell you what, that's the hardest road to get them to understand in terms of our workforce. But I think we're slowly getting there.
Yeah, protests are seen as a very negative thing, right? So contracting officers aren't graded on the amount or the quality of the contracting they put out, right? They're graded on the amount of contracting that they put out constantly within the agencies, despite many efforts to change the perception. So protests are seen as kind of the failing grade, right? Something has gone so horribly wrong that now we've got lawyers involved. Oh my goodness, isn't that the worst possible thing ever? But in reality, the protest process really is a check and balance. It really is something that is designed to keep the process fair. And they're not really something that should be feared. But at the same time, they're a tremendous waste of time, right? So there's something that takes an incredible amount of time to deal with on the government side. It's a huge amount of paperwork. There's a lot of back and forth. There's timelines that are enforced as a result of that. So in addition to just being a negative thing in the minds of the contracting staff, it also is something that's going to delay the procurement. On the flip side of that, though, ironically, that hasn't changed much about the way that we handle our approach to dealing with vendors to try to avoid that, or to try to avoid the whole process of going through the protest. And communication actually is the inverse of that, right? So it's just the opposite happens. When we have good debriefs, when we have good solicitations, we don't get those types of protests. But it's incredibly, we're not focused quite on that just yet.
Right. Never enough time to do it, right? Always time to do it over. Joanie?
Yes, so apparently all roads lead to debriefings, right? So my favorite thing to do in debriefings is to make sure that you invite the technical folks, the folks that did the evaluation. There's nothing like a great opportunity for them to interface with the vendors. As contracting officer, you're sort of on your own. You weren't sitting there usually in the room when the evaluation took place. And it really helps to open and make it more open and transparent when you have the actual technical folks there. And it's a great learning experience for them because invariably they will do another evaluation and they're going to remember they were sitting in the room looking the vendor in the eye. And so it's a good way for them to step up to the plate and do the best evaluation possible and share it.
I just want to say one other thing. Let me ask the business people in the room. How many of you, Steve, I know some of you, so how many of you would do business with a company that you knew was reinvesting in an area that you were specifically focused on versus a company that wasn't? So if I was taking 2% of my profits and I was investing it in agile training for my entire workforce, and you were interested in purchasing agile training and another company wasn't, who would you rather do business with? Right? So why do I bring that up related to protests? There's a lot of work that happens in the front end of a procurement that directly relates to how the debriefing goes in the protest. And some of these questions, some of these thoughts, that if you ask them on the front end, you can actually plan a procurement so that you can give more targeted debriefing and you can award more specifically to what you're looking for. And that's what we're trying to do in terms of our push with our folks, is to make them understand that. Don't just be a contracting officer. Understand the business model that you're going to be engaging with, so that you can create a scenario where you can make a decision and get feedback to a vendor